for joining us for this webinar, which is part of the Great Stories Club project, and it's made possible by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm very excited to have Anna Mae Duane with us this afternoon. Anna Mae is Associate Professor of English at the University of Connecticut. She is one of our Great Stories Club National Project Scholars, and she worked with us beginning in around 2016 on all elements of the series Empathy, the Cost of Switching Sides. In addition to her work on the Great Stories Club and at the University of Connecticut, Anna Mae is also author of Suffering Childhood in Early America, Violence, Race, and the Making of the Child Victim, editor of the Children's Table, Childhood Studies and the Humanities, co-editor of Who Writes for Black Children, African American Children's Literature Before 1900, and many others. Her work has been supported by a Fulbright Award, as well as fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Many thanks to Anna Mae for taking the time out of her schedule to be with us today. Today is an opportunity for those of you who are doing the Great Stories Club Empathy themed grant, but were not with us at the September workshop in Chicago, to hear from Anna Mae about her vision for the series, the humanities scholarship that supports the empathy theme, and about some of the questions that this question explores in the books, excuse me. In just a minute, Anna Mae is going to share a presentation. It's about 25 minutes long that will provide a thematic overview of the series and then take a break for questions and comments. After that, she's going to guide us through 2 to 3 points of connection for each of the books that you're going to use with your readers, or maybe are already using with your readers. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A throughout, and we will break during a few different spots to check in with you, to hear from you, and hear your questions. And on that note, here are just a few instructions for communication in our virtual classroom. If you have any kind of a technical issue, please use the Q&A window. It should be at the bottom of your screens. Looks like participants, Q&A, share, chat, etc. Please use where it says Q&A to send a message to Brian Russell. He's our technical administrator in the classroom, and he will do his best to address your problem. If you have any difficulties, don't panic. The whole presentation is being recorded, and you'll be able to access it at any time beginning later this afternoon. We do ask you please not to put technical questions in the chat box. We want to preserve that space to talk about content, issues, questions, and just generally to communicate with each other in the classroom. For the Q&A sections, everybody will have the ability to submit questions through the chat feature. So you can type your questions there anytime. We're going to break a few different times and we can moderate the discussions. And then if you connected to the webinar by phone, you can also state your questions over the phone during the designated time. We just want to ask that you are muted, which sounds like everybody is. And finally, if you are one of the people that connected as a presenter, that would be using the link that went out in the last probably 2 hours. You will also have access to a webcam and a microphone. If you would like to submit questions that way, we would love to hear from you. We would love to see you. That would be terrific. So regardless of how you're accessing the webinar, I think the one takeaway here is that we just want to ask you to mute. And I think that's it in terms of how we'll structure things. So without further ado, I will pass it along to you, Anna Mae.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lainey and Brian, for setting this up. I'm really excited to be thinking about empathy with you again. I had such a great time with the folks in Chicago, spending a whole day sort of working through the different issues in these texts and in this theme. I'm really excited about the chance to come at it again and sort of see where we land. So just a couple of words about why I chose the theme. For one thing, you know, I chose it back in 2016, as Lainey said, but it seems even more relevant in some ways in 2018. We're in a moment where both picking sides seems really important in all sorts of ways. And I also think for young people, sort of finding your people, finding where you belong, finding where you feel at home is also a question that is of great importance. So empathy is one way to sort of think about how to gauge those two impulses that I think so much of our culture is struggling with right now. So to start with the beginning, what is empathy? Right, and the most basic definition I can think of is, right, it's to feel the pain of another. And in this very cute image, we sort of see one person is in distress, and you can see almost the contagion of, right, that first baby, for whatever reason, is upset about something, and the other two are now upset because they sense the distress of another, right? It's that sort of being unable to wall off the distress of another, that you take it on yourself and feel compelled to do something about it. Why empathy? I've already said sort of our own cultural moment makes me think of it, but it's largely cited as a universal good, right? Who is against empathy? It's often held up as a path to tolerance and as an antidote to violence. Literally and this is when I taught a class for empathy, that was the class that was supported by the NEH, and it wanted us to take on really big questions, and empathy is one characteristic that every major religion holds up as a virtue. You have virtually every tradition holds up empathy, the willingness to sort of feel the pain and to act on the distress of another, as something we should all be striving for. This is a reading group, and several studies cite literature as a means to cultivate empathy. And empathy itself is often placed at the heart of children and young adults literature. It's often something that motivates the plot. Lastly, empathy, or lack of it, right? The inability to feel empathy is often held up in evaluations, even diagnosis, of struggling or marginalized young people, who I imagine might be some of the people who will be reading these books. So this was some of the concerns, some of the questions I came to this theme with. Some questions from the scholarly side. So what are people who are studying empathy, both in the sciences and in the humanities, thinking about? What are they finding intriguing? Where is that? Where are those directions going? And one is, and this is sort of become relevant in the past maybe month or two, around the civility debate, right? How can or should we empathize with oppressors? And this is something that really comes up in March, book 3, actually all the books of March, this question of sort of how far can empathy go? Do we have to empathize with those who are actually inflicting harm, as well as those who are being victimized? Another big question of the moment is, how does technology erode or enhance empathy? And I'm sure this is something we could have a really vibrant discussion on. There's a lot of concern about how we mediate all our interactions through screens, as we are doing right this minute, right? We're having a class through a screen. So many of our students and the young people we work with, screens are the primary means of communication, which leads me to the second question. And this is, the third question. And this is something that primatologist Franz Duane has written a book about. He's written a book about sort of animal empathy, and he argues that you need a body to feel empathy, right? It's an embodied emotion. And if you don't have a person in front of you, it's much harder to feel that tug, right? The tug between those babies, where you sort of feel someone else's pain, distress pulling on you. It's much harder to do when it's through a phone in your hand. And there are counter arguments saying we're more in touch with the world's pain because we're able to see it more. But that's sort of one of the questions we can think about. Do we need to hear a story to empathize? This gets back to the question of literature. What activates empathy, right? Is it something we see? Is it something we're able to sort of take into our imagination? What is gained through empathy? What is lost? And this is something I really think is central to so many of the books in this series. Right? We sort of see empathy as something we're all supposed to be cultivating in our lives. It's a universal good. But in several of the books, empathy costs, right? You lose something. You lose a sense of certainty. You lose a sense of protection. Is it worth the cost? It's a question I think that all of these books explore in different ways. Other things that are just in scholarship, perhaps not as much in these books, but I think are interesting. Can we empathize with non-human creatures, right? Robots, animals, this is something that's increasingly becoming important as both we sort of pass human rights laws for primates in some contexts, and as computers and robots become more anthropomorphic. So that's something, you know, direction. If you find you have a class full of techie students, that can be another way to go. Where does empathy belong, or does it in a competitive world, right? This is students are, and young people generally are being taught that you need to sort of get out there and get your own. Is empathy something you can't afford anymore? Okay, a little bit of background about the term empathy. Actually, it's kind of a new word. It doesn't come into use until the late 19th century. And it's attributed to a man called Theodore Lips. He uses a German word that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but he sees it as a natural instinct and an inner imitation, right? And again, it's something that's involuntary, that's like sort of put into our bodies from someone else's body. And he uses the example of when we're all watching someone on a tightrope and his foot slips, right? And we all gasp, we all sort of feel that tension. That's what he sees as empathy, something that you absolutely are drawn into and kind of can't help. Oh, and see, I'm seeing the text is kind of getting covered up by my head, but I'll try to remember it as best I can. Adam Smith in the 18th century wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and he was using the term sympathy, but most people sort of see it as part of the genealogy of the term empathy. And what he says that however selfish you might expect to be, everyone has this. There's nothing, it's part of being human, that we are going to feel sad when we see sadness, and we are going to feel happiness when we see someone else's joy. And this is a moment where I think sort of drills down into several of the moments in the text we're going to be reading. He imagines a moment of violence. He says, we see our brother put up on the rack, and we see ourselves enduring all these same torments, right? We enter, as it were, into his body, and in some measure in the same person with him, right? We are literally feeling what he's feeling, right? We cannot sort of separate ourselves from this. But then he also says, as much as sort of this is involuntary, it's always an act of imagination, right? We are not actually in pain, right? Our bones aren't going to be broken. We are in no danger. It's always sort of by being able to imagine what it would be like for us, that you have this moment of connection. And right, so he again sort of sees it as bodily, but also connected to narrative, which is, so I think it's no accident that we have Adam Smith, who writes both about, he's sort of largely considered the father of modern capitalism and the Enlightenment, and the father of theories of sympathy, right? That we might think these are two oppositional discourses, right? Capitalism and empathy, and the democracy that sort of mediates both of them. But there's actually a lot of theorizing about how we need empathy if our democracy is going to work. For one thing, once we dispense, right, with hereditary titles, once we no longer sort of know where we fit and what we do by where someone was born, right, who their father is, we have to sort of evaluate each other on a different set, with a different set of standards. Right? Who do we trust? How do we know that we can trust them? What signals are valid? Right? These are all sort of new skills. If we're going to get rid of the monarchy and we're going to get rid of hereditary status, we need to sort of see each other as individuals and sort of try to gauge each other's hearts, to find a point on it, right? We have to sort of feel each other out, literally. In the 18th century, the most, right, you think, what was everybody reading as they were getting ready for the American Revolution? The most popular book was the seduction novel, which was a book in which sort of a sweet-talking, good-looking guy seduces a woman, right? She falls for his line. She falls for his charm, and of course is ruined by it because it's the 18th century. So if you have sex out of wedlock, you're going to die. So that's what happens, right? But this is a story that they keep reiterating. They can't get enough of it. The danger of getting sucked into someone else's feeling, of sort of letting that pull, that tug, a fellow feeling overwhelm your logic, right? Overwhelm your defenses. And the last thing is sort of, and this is sort of perhaps speaking to our own political moment in some ways, right? If we cannot empathize with each other, if we cannot trust that we're all working towards a similar goal, or sort of at least see the humanity in each other, there's no way we're going to accept each other's decisions, right? Votes, the sort of decisions that the majority makes that affects all of us, right? If we don't have enough fellow feeling with our fellow citizens, that deal is going to fall through. Empathy was also key then and now to social reform movements, in moments, and my specialty is 19th century anti-slavery movements, but we can sort of tie it to any number of social movements, certainly the civil rights movement as shows up in March. When you want to convince the powerful that they should relinquish that power, right? That something about the way that power is working is wrong. Empathy is a really powerful tool. And this is just a passage from perhaps the most successful sort of protest novel that was ever written, was Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. And this is just one passage, and you can see she is taking her child and trying to escape the slave trader. She's running across this frozen river. And the author here, just to take a moment, doesn't let us hang back, right? Really reaches out. The child is saying, "Do I have to keep awake?" The mother's saying, no, it's fine. And then, right, as if we're sort of thinking, okay, this is something that's nothing to do with me. That last paragraph still says, if it was your hand or your women, if it wants to be taunting you by a later tomorrow morning, if you had seen the man and heard that the papers were signed and delivered, and you had only to 12 o'clock till morning to make your escape, how fast would you walk? Right? This real insistence of like, I'm going to put it in your body. You're going to feel what you're doing. And people read this book and cried really hard and ran into the rain and pledged their life to abolition. So it is a powerful, very good basic, but nonetheless a really efficacious one. This was just an example from a more recent moment. This is actually two little girls in my town in Milford. This was right after the ban came down, and these two girls were shut out. They were coming from Syria, and they just were on the wrong plane, right, the wrong day. And this is Senator Chris Murphy taking their case to the floor of the Senate. And I'm just struck with how similar the language to what Harry did. Imagine what these two little girls went through, and a lot of little other boys that like them. They're the age of my own children, right? Imagine, take that story, imagine it being you or your child, in order to work down to seeing them as exactly. At least in this case, he was successful. Those two girls were able to make it in. Okay. So the examples I've already used are stories. We tell a story to turn an abstraction into an individual, to turn sort of our own distance from what's happening to someone else into something we take on ourselves. And there's been, right, this is a quote from the Scientific American, but the argument is that reading, more than other forms of storytelling, really push us to sort of cultivate, to sort of flex the muscle of empathy, and not just in stories that are sort of tearjerkers like Uncle Tom's Cabin, but right, they require us to figure out what's going on. They require us to imagine the motivations of characters that might be really different from us, that might be really alien to us, but we have to, if we're going to read successfully, we have to navigate that difference, right? We have to, at least for those pages you're turning, be willing to open up and imagine their distress, even if it's very different from a distress that's in your own life. So, right, oh, great, empathy is good. We should do it. You know, we should all be empathetic all the time. We're going to teach all these young people to be super empathetic, and it's going to be great. Not so fast, right? It's not. I want to complicate it a little, and I think the books complicate this question a little in really interesting ways. And there's been, right, so there's been a flood of studies and research about the good empathy does, and there's been a counter argument about, well, okay, empathy is a really powerful force, but almost always it's directed towards our own group, right? It's very easy to feel empathy for someone you already identify with. And that empathy can be such a powerful force that it can justify violence against, right, the other group, right? Because you feel so compelled to stop the pain of someone you identify with, it almost makes it easier to demonize the other side, right? Does empathy reside in the body, in the mind? If it can be taught, can we learn to sort of expand it out of our group? If so, how? If not, why teach it, right? If it's something that's hardwired and we can't cultivate it or expand it, is it something we need to, right? We need to be more wary of than we currently are. And so this is a book by Paul Bloom, and he makes the case against empathy. And one thing I wanted to sort of pinpoint is, right, empathy's design failings have to do with the fact that it acts like a spotlight, right? You sort of have this moment when you can't see anything but the person in front of you. And it's an incredibly powerful focusing force, but it can also be a force that, right, shuts out everything else. And that in itself can be a dangerous force. And so turning to the books, I wanted to I was drawn to these books because in some ways I think they all encompass both these aspects of empathy, both the really powerful potential of it as a transformative force for social justice, for good, for diminishing the violence in the world, and empathy as a force that intensifies the violence in the world. The empathy as a force of tribal loyalty or sort of group loyalty that puts us, that sort of focuses a dangerous sort of loyalty, a violent sort of loyalty. So as we turn to the books, right, these were some of the questions I was thinking of and that we discussed in Chicago is, how does the bias, right, towards our group function in Flight, All American Boys, Kindred, March, and Stuck in Neutral? How do the characters respond? How do your readers respond to this question of loyalty, to this question of sort of, do I identify with the person who's going to cost me something, right? Who's going to demand something that I'd rather not give. And the last thing I wanted to think about in terms of empathy, particularly with many of the young people you're all working with, is, right, the feeling of sort of you yourself being denied that empathy, right? Of people refusing to see your distress, to make that connection, right? To see you even as a person worth imagining, right? Whose story matters. And this is, and this I suggested in sort of the documentation I gave as perhaps an extra reading. And honestly, I mean, it's a short chapter to begin with. It's from W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And this is from the first chapter. And honestly, when I teach this in class, sometimes I'll just teach 2 paragraphs from it. I'll just teach this paragraph if we're short on time, because it's so rich, and it provides language and sort of a framework, I think, that is really transportable to lots of different texts. So I'll just look at it really quickly, right? He's writing as a Black man in 1903. pretty much the nadir of race relations, historians feel, in this country. And he's talking about how does it feel, a double consciousness, he calls it, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. And for me, double consciousness is so powerful as a concept because it's sort of, it's about empathy for yourself, or sort of how do you negotiate a world which denies you empathy? How do you sort of perform the role of the world, or at least sort of give lip service to what the world sees about you, right? You can't ignore that this is sort of the mask the world has put on you, like it or not. And how do you sort of maintain a sense of self around that? And we see this in several of the books. How do you sort of hold on to an integrity in a world that denies you empathy? How do you sort of stay connected to your own story when no one wants to hear it? So I'll wrap up this part and just with some questions about the books themselves. Some of the big questions that I think almost every book can support that we chose of the 5 that I selected. When does empathy become possible? In each of these books, there's a moment where there's an ask for empathy. What facilitates it? What closes it down? What has to happen for it to be transformative? Right? You might feel it and deny it. What has to happen for it to actually change the dynamic in the book, the character, the trajectory of the story? What are the risks of allowing oneself to feel empathy? Does empathy carry a moral obligation? Right? Once we feel it, can we just cry and right? That was a critique of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that we just, or you know, clickbait activism, that we just sort of see something, we cry, we pat ourselves on the back that we feel we're good people because we cried, and then you don't do anything. Right? What is the moral obligation of this feeling? Does this emotion carry with it an obligation, a demand that we do something about it? And what happens when one feels oneself outside of empathy, when right, those stories are denied, that sort of connection you want to make is refused. So that is my general overview for the questions I was thinking about, the background I was bringing to this question. Lainey, I don't know if we want to take a break and sort of digest that for a few minutes, or I could move on to the book. It's up to you.
Sure. Well, I will defer to the group, and I wanted to just start by saying I went to submit a technical inquiry to Brian and found that, at least from where I'm sitting, this instruction that I gave all of you of clicking Q&A did not work. I could not submit a question. So
oh no,
feel free to put any concerns that you have in the chat box. That's just fine. So now seems like a good time to break and see if any of our attendees have any questions for you based on the thematic overview. Feel free to jump in with microphone or by phone or in the chat if you have one. Give it just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything come in. If anything occurs to anyone during the next section, feel free to add your comment to the chat area, and I'll hand it back to you, Annie.
Okay, awesome. So what I thought I'd do now is just sort of pick, and there's all these books, hopefully you're finding really sort of rich, and there's of course dozens of different directions to go. I just thought I would, when I was reading through them, thinking about these questions, a couple of moments that jumped out to me, a couple of questions that I found useful, and I'd be really interested to see, you know, if you've been teaching them already, or if you're planning to teach them, if you've, you know, what sort of ways in you found thinking about these books in terms of some of these larger questions. Okay, so one thing I shared at the Chicago workshop that I found, that I think people found useful, and I've used it in my own teaching and I found useful, is right, starting with definitions, figuring out where you are, where your group is on what empathy even is, right? If this is going to be a theme. And so this is, there's lots of different ways to do this. On the workshop, I think I gave it to a group of 3 or 4 people. The idea is you put empathy in the word box, and people have to, and there can be several different definitions. What is it? And you can get a dictionary definition, which might not be that helpful, but what does it look like, right? What are the characteristics? I remember one of the terms that came up that I found really intriguing was brave. Someone used the term brave as a characteristic of empathy, which isn't something I would have immediately thought, but I thought that's powerful, right? That's a really great observation. Examples, and this can be examples from the students' own lives, from movies they've seen, from other books they've read, just any example of someone being empathetic. And I also think equally as important is non-examples, right? What does empathy not look like? How do you know when what you're seeing is not empathy? And this I find particularly useful for sort of for providing you with keywords that you can pull on as you progress through the books. Like, for instance, if one of your group used brave as a characteristic, if that's something that comes up, that's something you can keep returning to, right? The courage.
Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Do you hear? Okay. Anna Mae, your audio is gone.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay, maybe something went wrong with my headphones.
I don't know, but you're clear now.
Okay. So how long was that going on with no one hearing you? Did any of the Freire model stuff come up?
I heard you talking about the Freire model, and when you were saying about it's important to include non-examples, I feel like it was around that time.
Okay. The only other thing I was mentioning is that this could be really useful either before every book, or depending on where you are, before and after every book. I found that really useful, so you can sort of have a vague sense of what you think empathy is in general, and then you read Flight or March, and you have them use examples from the books, characteristics in the books. It's a way of sort of moving from sort of this general idea of what you think from how the book defines something. And right, it can be really interesting to sort of see by the end if you have 3 of these, right? How do these 3 books define empathy in different ways? And you can do it with this model, you can do it with sticky notes, you can be creative with all the ways you can sort of think about it, but this also provides, I think, a sort of neat example for close reading, right? That you can sort of make them say, what are the characteristics of empathy in Flight, not just sort of in your own life, in this book. And it's sort of contained. Okay, so now the books themselves. I want to sort of do a lightning round here. So for me, Flight, right, is in some ways the most literal enactment of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, right? You can't have a sort of more explicit manifestation of empathy than Zitz, who literally goes in the bodies of all these different people. Right, and that's his journey. So in some ways, this is, I imagine that if you choose this book, this might be a good one to start with. And right from the very beginning, we have, right, and this is just one quote from it, but this is sort of, if not the first page, like the second page, that he's dying of shame, right? That he's ugly, he sees himself in the mirror, he calls himself Zitz. he doesn't even have his real name, right? So this, right, this sort of mirror moment of double consciousness, but he's completely taken in the story other people tell about him, right? He has no empathy for his own story. He's just sort of seeing himself through the eyes of others. He knows exactly how everyone sees him. And I think, right, again, it's sort of one moment for close reading that, early on in the book, it can be interesting, is just sort of the breakfast scene, right, where someone says good morning and it says F you, right? We can't have a better example of non-empathy, right? They are not feeling each other at all, right? They're in completely different emotional worlds. And no one is willing to sort of find any common ground. They see each other as an enemy from the beginning, or at least Zitz does, right? And one of the questions I think that's interesting is sort of how reliable of a narrator is Zitz, at least in the beginning, right? That he sees he knows exactly how the parents are, he knows what the whole story is going to be, but he doesn't, right? But he's just so, he's just been so damaged by this story playing out over and over again, he can't imagine, right? He can't imagine this person's feelings at all, right? He knows it all, right? Which is, again, I think maybe a place to think about how being really attached to our old stories prevents empathy, right? Of sort of, if you know how it's going to go, you don't need to feel anything different, right? And both the protection that provides and what that shuts out. One of the central themes of this book that I found really important, or that I found really intriguing, is the conflict between the desire for justice and the desire for empathy, right? The desire for connection. The fact that Zitz pals up with someone named Justice, who wants him to sort of avenge his ancestors, right? To reenact the ghost dance. Right? It's, there's no way around it. His name is Justice. Right? Does justice, right? If you've been wronged, if you want justice, what does that require? Is it the same as vengeance? Is there a way to think about justice in a different way than is presented in the beginning of this book, right? What Justice, the character, promotes is bloodshed, right? Is vengeance, is sort of causing pain now to try to ameliorate the pain of the past. But which is, again, it's sort of this misguided loyalty, this sort of grief that gets misguided, right? That gets turned into violence. And this, I think, again, I think for anyone who's experienced past harm, real trauma, right? This impulse to sort of avenge it, to sort of not feel it, to inflict pain on others in a way that, in a misguided hope of sort of that of healing the pain in the present by sort of addressing a pain in the past. I think it's a really rich moment. Other things that I found important here are the series of friendships. Right, we have Jimmy and Abad, right, and Jimmy, of course, teaches Abad to become a pilot, which gets used for violence. We have Hank and Art, the two FBI agents who also sort of conspire to commit violence, and Justice and Zitz, right? So how do we sort of think about these friendships? Which, again, I think, right, is such an important topic for young people, sort of how, right, that the power of that connection between all of these men, and it's, largely men in the book. How does that, what are the benefits and what are the downfalls of it? Right? I think as the book progresses, the question of sort of what harm is done by this sort of loyalty pact that all these men have in different ways becomes something that's really interesting to explore. So what are the costs, right? As it progresses, as it becomes more empathetic, what are the costs of that empathy, right? It's not, technically we do wind up with a happy ending, but there's, it's not uncomplicated, Zitz's journey. So he starts, right, he's willing to shoot people in a bank. By page 106, he's unable to shoot, right, even in self-defense. So I think that's a really powerful moment of, if we feel someone else's pain, right, if we are so connected to someone else what protections do we lose for ourselves? In this moment, he literally can't shoot in self-defense because he's so unable to sort of put that wall back up, right? To sort of see someone else as an enemy. And sometimes people are our enemies. So that's a place, I think, to explore that's really rich. By page 161, his friend, the police officer, Dave, I believe, tells him he had to stop caring, that he'd seen too much pain, he can't feel it anymore. This, again, I think can be a really rich moment for anyone who's struggled with what they've witnessed and their own pain. And there's, I care too much, I couldn't save them, you matter, everyone matters. And of course, that's what we're all supposed to come to, but it's also a very difficult way to live. And I think this book addresses that, doesn't write it off as like, we all just love each other and the world will be better. Yes, but it's hard. Okay, so if there's no questions about flight, I'll think about kindred with you for a couple of minutes. Just gonna grab some water. And putting kindred and flight together sort of helped elucidate for me a sort of sub-theme of this question, which was empathy and history, right? How do we have empathy for our own history? How do we have empathy for those who've gone before us? How do we sort of integrate the traumas of the past into sort of a full way of living in the moment, or sort of how do we sort of make peace with the past that we can't fix, right? That we might feel the pain for, but we can't address in the same way that, right, when Chris Murphy goes on the floor of the Senate, he's asking for something that we can do because we feel this tug. If something's already over, it's a different set of questions. It's a different set of options. So of course, kindred raises this in a really spectacularly creative and provocative way. She is a woman from the 1970s who is transported back to her own, the time of her own ancestors, right? The slave plantation in which her great-great-grandmother was born. So, I mean, some of the questions that this book asks that I found really important is, how does the past shape the present? What options does Dana have? Right? She's not entirely free to do what she feels is right. The past constrains her. She doesn't, right? It sort of gives her a place and a set of options that aren't what she would choose. And I think this is something, again, that can be a really useful place to explore. Can empathy be taught, right? Which is interesting for us as teachers and instructors, but it's Dana's task, right? If she can teach Rufus to be different, she will make life much easier for her own ancestor, for herself, for everyone on the plantation. Her own conscience will be sort of eased because she will not have just sort of stood by as an accomplice to wrongdoing. If she can teach him to sort of feel the pain he's inflicting and feel remorse for it, or feel obligated to do something about it, it would be a revolutionary act. Doubling, right? There's so much doubling, which is sort of a neat literary place to take your readers if it's something they're interested in, right? We have Dana and Alice, we have Rufus and Kevin, we have all these sort of doubles between the past and the future. And in some ways, right, it asks the question of, how do we repeat old patterns? How, right, just as in that moment where Zips knows the whole story, right, when he walks into the breakfast table. So of course it's going to be the same story because he thinks he knows it already, right? Or he's so trapped in that groove. We have in Kindred really powerful representations of how that groove plays out over generations as well as over individual lives. And it also raises a question that flight raises as well. Perhaps it gives us a different answer. How do we pick a side when we realize we're both? Right? How do we know who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, who it's okay to hurt, and who we should feel sympathy for, empathy for, once we realize we're implicated in both sides, right? That the bad guys want some of the same things we want, or have been hurt the same ways we've been hurt. And this is something, right, for Dana, it's literal, right? It's sort of this really stark division between black and white, slave and slave owner, but her own history doesn't allow her to sort of easily abandon one for the other, right? She's both. And one of the things I think is powerful about this book is sort of shows us how the country is both, right? We don't have a choice in it, but we're all here because of that history. So what do we do with it? What are our options? Okay, the book is about struggling with the past. One of the moments I zoom in on early on, and also because I find students sometimes just aren't quite sure what's happening. The trouble started long before June 9th. That is a moment, right, that sort of really exemplifies this question of the past. When did the trouble start? When did, and this is a place depending on how your group is going, like for a moment of creative writing or reflection or an activity, right? When did the trouble start? Not the day that you got in trouble, a day, years, generations before this one day, right? That sort of brought things to a head. And I've also actually found it helpful to have students actually unpack what's exactly happening. That she has to go back, right? It's the grandfather paradox. She has to make sure that the past basically stays the same, right? That it doesn't change, even though it has horrors attached to it. Okay, one other thing I found really interesting, and then I'll move on to our next. I love this book. I love all the books, but Kindred is so rich. But this is a moment of biography about Octavia Butler that I found really compelling. And it was given in an interview, and she talks about the lack of empathy she had for her own mother, who worked as a domestic worker and had to endure all sorts of indignities, right? And had to, again, if we're thinking of double consciousness, sort of adapt herself to the way the world wanted her to be, sort of the mask the world placed on her. And Octavia Butler just had disdain for this accommodation that she saw her mother making. And this particular passage in the book, but throughout the book, it's about forgiving either ourselves or our family or our past for the accommodations that they've made, right? To have empathy for what people have had to do to survive. And more than empathy, it's sort of admiration. To sort of see these moments of struggle as not weakness, but of strength. Okay, one of the big questions of the book, right, by the end of the book is, why can't Rufus empathize with others, right? If one of the tasks is to teach him to empathize, why doesn't it work? And there are moments where, right, it almost works, but it doesn't, right? By the end, he reverts to being a lot like his father, perhaps even worse. So why doesn't it work? What would have to happen for it to work? Why does he knows better. Why does he fall again into that same pattern? Okay. Next book, All American Boys. And this book for me, right, is again, lots of interesting things to think about. But for me, one of the real sort of crystallizations that happens in this book is this moment of witnessing. When we see something, right? When we see, to go back to Adam Smith, the man put upon the rack, or we see Eliza crossing the Ohio River with her baby, and we feel it, right? We feel that we know something's wrong. We have sort of let it in. What do we do? Are we obligated to do something? Is it different just from seeing personally than hearing about it? What happens? So just one way into this book is to sort of unpack what are everyone's reactions to this witnessed moment, right? And we have this moment where, of course, Quinn witnesses, and then through social media, everyone witnesses, right? Everyone, which is a really interesting set of questions about how these moments of brutality are being shared, are being seen by so many people. and the questions and the demands and the moral obligations it perhaps asks of all of us, or there's been arguments that it is deadening our ability to feel empathy. And I think that's a moment that students can find really provocative, right? Because it's something they're navigating every day. So what does Clinton want to do? What does teachers want to do? What do the losers want to do? Why? Where are they coming from? You know, and from there, sort of a question of sort of what constrains us from, right, what shuts down that moment of empathy, what allows it to sort of flourish or to sort of transform into something different. Once you see, what do you do? Why do you do it? What keeps you from doing it? And this was, you know, a sort of beautiful quote that the book evokes. If you are neutral in the situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And I think that that's a powerful, beautiful quote, but I think, again, it's up for debate. It's up for debate in this book. I think it's up for debate in the lives of your readers and in the lives of all of us, right? Is that true? Do we have to get involved every time we see oppression? What are the things that disallow that? What would be the cost of doing that? Why are those costs worth it? And I think that's a question I would thread through all of those books, right? That there's a cost of losing a certain sense of identity and protection. What are the benefits? What happens when we do sort of take that risk? And again, for students, you can ask them situations in their own life, in school, wherever they're at. Is there a situation where doing nothing is the wrong thing? There's a situation where doing nothing is the right thing. What should compel us to act, right? When should our feelings compel us to act? What is, you know, in some ways, this is a question of conscience. Once we sort of know on an emotional, physical level, the pain of others, what do we do about it? Okay, March. Again, incredibly powerful, right? The only nonfiction book we have on the list. Again, a connection to All American Boys, the power of witnessing, again and again comes up in this book. The urge to silence, to go back to the status quo. There's so much, and one thing I learned about this book is, right, how LBJ just kept wanting to sort of tell everybody to calm down and just wait. Just, you know, let's not do anything right now. Let's just keep things as they are. And there's this narrative that, you know, I've been exposed to, and I think gets taught in a lot of schools, that the civil rights movement was, among other things, this movement that sort of touched the hearts of the powerful, of white people generally, and sort of moved them to, and once they sort of, their hearts were moved, political action happened. And March tells a very different story. Certainly that's part of it, but it's consistent political, you know, just perseverance. When that empathy is denied, you don't, right, that's not the end of the story. And one of the things this book, one of the sort of themes of empathy that this book really elucidates in beautiful ways, like, is the question of nonviolence. Right, why, and it comes up again of that we're going to remain nonviolent in the face of incredible violence. Why is that powerful? And again, I think this is a really powerful question to ask after you've been thinking about empathy for a while. What happens when you refuse to fight back? Right, what changes? How is that different than if you actually fight back? What shifts, and for who and why? Right, and actually, in my slide, part of the picture is covered up, but there are several passages like this, frames like this, where you sort of see the moment of close-up when the person decides to act violently, but then you also see the witness watching this, and that dynamic between the person who sees someone else's face afraid and still acts violently, and then the witness who sees this moment, and sort of the power dynamic between all three of them. Right? And we have, you know, moments of testimony when people tell their stories of the violence that happened to them. and how that works or doesn't work. Okay, and now we're on to Stuck in Neutral, which is a different, right, it's in some ways non-political. It's in some ways a smaller story. It's a father and son. There's really no questions of sort of larger issues of racial or ethnic injustice or historical injustice. It's sort of a boy and his father, but it raises really deep issues about sort of the way empathy can be misused or can sort of be weaponized, even it's particularly in cases when it's adults acting on for the good of young people. And again, I think this is a struggle that many of your readers may be very familiar with, right? People sort of insisting that they're doing this out of empathy, doing this out of love, doing this out of sort of a knowledge of their pain when they're really not engaging at all. So, right, of course, it's a question of the plot of this book is a severely disabled, nonverbal child whose father is so moved by his imagined pain, wants to euthanize him, right? And so, in some ways, right, this goes to a really basic tenet of empathy, right? If we think of the golden rule, which is, again, something we all, or many of us get taught early on in one form or another, right? Do unto others as you would have done unto you. But what if what the other person wants is completely different from what you want? What if you can't imagine what the other person wants? And that's the question here, right? How does empathy function when communication is cut off? The father feels his son's pain, but he doesn't, of course, right? He imagines the wrong thing. He imagines what he would feel. He projects his own pain onto his son and then takes the action that he feels is right. And I think, right, this is, again, one of the dangers of empathy, right? Of getting swept up in that sort of, that, you know, admirable feeling of wanting to help, of wanting to fix it for someone else. That what your fix is may not be what that person needs, right? And that's not really empathy, right? That's about the savior. That's about you thinking you know all the answers. And in some ways, right, it's the opposite of empathy. It feels nice. It seems like it's not. You can tell yourself it's a good story, but it's not helping the other. It's not empathy. It's not really engaging the other person. Right. So Sean sort of is angry at his father's suggestion to end his pain. It makes me mad. What right does he have to act about it, to talk about ending my pain? How long, before he does more than talk? This sort of idea of, again, if we're so motivated by what we tell ourselves are noble values or empathetic values, then, right, where's the limit? If we're doing it for someone else, what sort of guidelines, what sort of moral guardrails come down? And one of the questions I always ask with this book, and I always get a really interesting set of answers, is the father a villain in this book, right? In some way, right, he's attempting to kill his son, which in most books would make you a villain. He's misguided. He thinks he's doing it out of love. The son will be dead in either case. What do we do with the father? Right? Is he a good guy? If he's not a good guy, why not? What's gone wrong? And it really sort of asks us to dig into misguided love, right? Misguided power over the less powerful in the name of benevolence, of love, of knowing better. And I think this is a particular dynamic for young people to engage, right? It's something that almost all going to be familiar with. And that sort of comprises some of the thoughts I've had, some of the threads I've seen going through these books and this theme. Thank you so much for listening. It's been fun to sort of revisit this material again.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting, Anime.
Thank you.
Some things to think about in the books. Since we are here together, it's 2:30. We can end now, or if anyone has questions or thoughts to share, I encourage you to do that while we are here together in the same space. Keep an eye on chat for messages, and if not, I would like to thank all of you for coming to this webinar during a month that I know everybody's very, very busy and has a lot of things going on. Thank you for taking the time to engage with the project today. Thank you to Anime for preparing such a presentation. We will also have this full PowerPoint available. If anybody would like it in that format, you can send an email to Brian and he can send you that file if you would like it. And as always, thanks to NVH for supporting learning opportunities like these. So I think that's it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
all.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.